It was a crisp autumn morning in the quiet suburban enclave of Maplewood Heights. The kind of morning where the air smelled faintly of fallen leaves and the distant hum of lawnmowers signaled the start of another uneventful day. The neighborhood, with its neatly trimmed hedges and perfectly aligned mailboxes, was the epitome of suburban bliss. But beneath the surface of this idyllic community, tensions were brewing, and they were about to boil over. I had lived in Maplewood Heights for 3 years, and for the most part, it had been a peaceful existence. The Homeowners Association, HOA, was run by a group of well-meaning retirees who enforced the rules with a gentle hand. The guidelines were simple. Keep your lawn tidy, don't paint your house neon green, and for the love of all that is holy, don't leave your trash bins out past collection day. It was a system that worked until she moved in. Her name was Margaret Hargrove, and from the moment she arrived, it was clear that she had a vision for Maplewood Heights, a vision that didn't include the rest of us. Margaret was a tall, imposing woman with a penchant for designer suits and a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to her hand. She had moved into the largest house on the block, a sprawling colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn that looked like it had been trimmed with a pair of scissors. Within weeks of her arrival, she had announced her candidacy for the HOA board, and her campaign speech was nothing short of a declaration of war. "I've noticed a disturbing trend in our community," she announced at the annual HOA meeting, her voice dripping with disdain. "Sloppy landscaping, mismatched paint colors, and, dare I say it, garden gnomes in unapproved poses." She paused for effect, her eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to challenge her. "If elected, I promise to restore Maplewood Heights to its former glory. We will have standards." And just like that, Margaret Hargrove became the newest member of the HOA board. The election wasn't even close. Most of the residents had better things to do than attend HOA meetings, and those who did show up were either too intimidated or too apathetic to vote against her. Margaret's victory was a turning point for Maplewood Heights, though none of us realized it at the time. Margaret wasted no time in implementing her vision for the neighborhood. Within days of her election, violation notices began appearing in mailboxes across Maplewood Heights. The first wave targeted minor infractions: a lawn that was half an inch too long, a mailbox that hadn't been polished in months, and, God forbid, a garden gnome that was doing a handstand instead of standing upright. But Margaret's true obsession was with the color of driveways. According to her, any deviation from the approved shade of gray was a crime against the community. She carried a color swatch in her purse and would stop to inspect driveways on her morning walks, her clipboard at the ready. It didn't take long for her to set her sights on mine. "Your driveway is discolored," she announced one morning, standing at the edge of my property with her ever-present clipboard. I was heading to work, but I stopped when I saw her measuring the width of my driveway with a bright yellow tape measure. "Good morning, Margaret," I said, trying to keep my tone polite. "The driveway was approved by the HOA when I moved in. If you have concerns, you can submit them through the proper channels." She adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and pursed her lips into that particular expression that suggested she was doing everyone a favor by gracing us with her presence. "I am the proper channel now," she said, "and I'm telling you this driveway is in violation. You have 2 weeks to resurface it." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was a professional who handled difficult personalities every day at work. "Margaret, that's not a reasonable request. The driveway is perfectly functional, and any slight variation in color is normal for concrete of this age." She pulled out her phone and started taking photos, each snap punctuated by a disapproving TSK. "I've documented the violation," she said. "See these darker patches? Completely unacceptable. It's bringing down property values." "It's a 2-year-old concrete driveway," I pointed out. "Some weathering is normal. I'd be happy to have a professional concrete contractor examine it, if you're concerned." "Oh, I've already consulted with several experts," she said, though I noticed she didn't name any. "They all agree with me. This level of discoloration is simply unacceptable in a premium community like Maplewood Heights." I tried explaining that slight discoloration was normal for 2-year-old concrete, especially in our climate. I even offered to power wash it, though I knew it wasn't necessary. But Margaret was on a mission. Over the next month, I received 3 official violation notices, each accompanied by increasingly aggressive personal visits from Margaret. The first notice arrived in a certified letter, complete with close-up photos of my allegedly offensive driveway and highlighted excerpts from the HOA guidelines. The second came with a $150 fine and more photos, this time with helpful arrows pointing to areas Margaret found particularly objectionable. The third notice included a deadline: fix the driveway within 7 days or face escalated enforcement actions. I appealed to the other board members, but Margaret had somehow maneuvered herself into being the head of the Architectural Review Committee. My neighbors were sympathetic but hesitant to get involved. Just last week, she cited the Patels for having wind chimes that exceeded the approved decibel level. My next-door neighbor, Susan, whispered to me one evening. She actually brought a decibel meter to measure them. The situation might have remained a simple annoyance if not for that flat tire. I'd been working from home that Wednesday morning on a video call with clients when I heard an odd mechanical sound from outside. I apologized to my team and stepped away to investigate, only to discover 2 nails in my rear tire. Strange, since I hadn't driven over any construction areas recently. As I was examining the damage, the unmistakable sound of a jackhammer shattered the quiet of our suburban street. I rounded the corner of my house to find Margaret Hargrove, dressed in what appeared to be brand-new work boots and a safety vest that still had the price tag dangling from it, operating a rented jackhammer on my driveway. She had already carved a jagged trench about 3 feet long into my supposedly substandard concrete. "Margaret," I shouted over the noise, barely able to believe what I was seeing. "Stop immediately. This is illegal." She killed the jackhammer and pushed her safety glasses up onto her forehead, revealing the kind of satisfied smirk usually reserved for cartoon villains. "Oh good, you're home. Since you refused to address the violation, the HOA is taking corrective action. Don't worry, I'll bill you for the repair work." I pulled out my phone and started recording, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Margaret, you have no legal authority to destroy my property. Pack up your equipment and leave now, or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," she smirked, reaching for the jackhammer again. "I have documentation of your violations. The HOA bylaws clearly state." The rest of her sentence was drowned out by the renewed hammering. I was already dialing 911 when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. About 6 feet from where Margaret was enthusiastically destroying my driveway, a small yellow flag marked the presence of underground utilities. I noticed it last week when the gas company had been doing their routine line inspections. "Margaret, stop!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically. "There are gas lines." The sound was different this time, more hollow. Margaret must have felt it too because she paused, frowning at the ground. That's when I smelled it, the unmistakable rotten egg odor of natural gas. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. My neighbor Ted, a retired firefighter who had spent 30 years with the city's fire department, came running out of his house, shouting for everyone to clear the area. Margaret finally seemed to realize the gravity of the situation, dropping the jackhammer with a clang that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent street. Car alarms started going off as the gas leak grew stronger, their electronic wailing a perfect soundtrack to the chaos unfolding on our usually quiet street. I was already on the phone with 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported a gas leak in a residential area. The dispatcher assured me emergency services were on their way, but those next few minutes felt like hours. The gas company's emergency response team arrived first, their bright yellow truck screaming down our street with lights flashing, followed by what seemed like every fire truck and police car in the city. Ted, bless him, had already started going door to door, making sure everyone was evacuating. "Get back," he shouted, his years of emergency response training kicking in. "Everyone needs to be at least 200 feet back." The local news vans weren't far behind the emergency vehicles because nothing draws media attention quite like the possibility of a suburban neighborhood going up in flames. As the authorities evacuated our street, I couldn't help but notice Margaret's face growing paler by the minute. Her designer sunglasses were now perched crookedly on her head, and her perfectly styled hair was coming undone in the growing chaos. But it wasn't until the police chief's cruiser pulled up that she truly started to panic. Chief Martinez stepped out of his car, the same model as mine, I noticed with a touch of irony, and surveyed the scene with a grim expression. His eyes moved from the abandoned jackhammer to the growing crowd of evacuated neighbors, many of whom were pointing at Margaret and talking animatedly into their phones. Some were already live-streaming the whole thing because, of course, they were. Finally, his gaze settled on me. "Miss Hargrove," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. "I believe we need to have a conversation about unauthorized excavation and damage to public utilities." Margaret's clipboard clattered to the ground, the sound somehow louder than it should have been in the tense atmosphere. As it turned out, her day was about to get much, much worse. The next few hours were a blur of emergency vehicles, news reporters, and increasingly panicked text messages from neighbors who'd been evacuated to the nearby shopping center parking lot. The gas company crews worked efficiently to shut off the line and begin repairs, but the damage was already done, both to the infrastructure and to Margaret's carefully cultivated image of authority. I stood with Chief Martinez near his police cruiser, explaining everything that had led up to this moment. When I mentioned the mysterious flat tire I discovered just before Margaret started her unauthorized demolition work, his expression darkened. "Show me," he said, following me to my car. He examined the nails embedded in my tire, then pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. These matched the ones we found in my cruiser's tire this morning. Same unusual head design. They're specialty flooring nails. He straightened up, his face grim. And I know exactly where they came from. It turned out Margaret had been doing some home renovations the previous week. Several neighbors had complained about construction debris in the street, including distinctive flooring nails that had scattered during her contractor's work. She dismissed their concerns, naturally, because HOA board members apparently didn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. "The nails in your tire and my cruiser aren't accidents," Chief Martinez said. "They're evidence of criminal vandalism. Your security cameras catch anything?" As a matter of fact, they had. After Margaret's increasingly aggressive violation notices, I'd installed a comprehensive security system. The previous night's footage clearly showed a figure in a distinctive designer tracksuit, Margaret's signature look for her early morning inspection walks, sprinkling something near my car and the chief's cruiser, which he often parked in front of his house, just down the street. While we reviewed the footage, the gas company's assessment team delivered their preliminary report. The damage was extensive. Margaret's jackhammer had not only ruptured the main gas line, but had also compromised several other utility connections. The entire street would need emergency repairs, and several homes would be without gas service for at least a week. Margaret, meanwhile, had moved from pale to slightly green as the consequences of her actions became clear. The utility company supervisor was explaining to her exactly how many state and local laws she'd violated, while a growing crowd of neighbors watched from behind the safety cordon, many of them live-streaming the whole thing. "Ma'am, did you contact 811 for utility marking before beginning excavation?" the supervisor asked, though we all knew the answer. I didn't think," Margaret stammered, her designer's sunglasses now clutched nervously in her manicured hands. "No, you didn't." Ted, my firefighter neighbor, cut in. He'd joined the group after helping coordinate the evacuation, and it could have gotten someone killed. "Do you have any idea what could have happened if that gas had found an ignition source?" The gravity of the situation finally seemed to hit Margaret. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time since I'd known her, she was completely speechless. But the day's revelations weren't over yet. As if the gas line rupture and nail vandalism weren't enough, Margaret's actions had triggered a cascade of investigations. The county prosecutor's office took a particular interest in her HOA activities, especially after several neighbors came forward with stories of suspicious damage to their properties following disputes with Margaret. The Patels, it turned out, hadn't just received a citation for their wind chimes. They'd found their carefully tended garden destroyed the day after challenging one of Margaret's violations. The Hendersons' non-approved birthday party had ended with mysterious scratches all over their cars. And Mrs. Chin's handstanding garden gnome hadn't just disappeared. It had been smashed, and the pieces arranged in what she described as a threatening manner on her doorstep. "We've been documenting everything," Mrs. Chin revealed, pulling out a thick folder of photographs and correspondence. "We were afraid to come forward individually, but together." She gestured to the group of neighbors who had gathered around her, each with their own stories of Margaret's escalating tactics. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for that evening, once the gas line was secured and residents were allowed to return home. The community center was packed. I'd never seen so many people at an HOA meeting. Margaret's chair at the board table remained conspicuously empty. In light of today's events and the ongoing criminal investigation, the board president announced, "We've unanimously voted to remove Margaret Hargrove from her position on the board. Furthermore, we're initiating a complete review of all violations and fines issued during her tenure." The room erupted in applause, but the board wasn't finished. They proceeded to introduce a series of reforms to prevent future abuses of power, including mandatory ethics training for board members, a new appeals process for violations, and, my personal favorite, a requirement that all enforcement actions be approved by at least 2 board members. Mrs. Chun was elected to fill Margaret's vacant board seat. Her first official act was to propose an amendment to the garden decor guidelines, specifically permitting gnomes in any pose that brings joy to the community. It passed unanimously. As for Margaret, the consequences of her actions continued to unfold in the weeks that followed. The criminal charges for vandalism and reckless endangerment were just the beginning. The gas company's civil lawsuit for damages would keep her lawyers busy for months. Her real estate business suffered too, once the video of her jackhammer rampage went viral. Turns out, potential clients aren't particularly eager to work with an agent who became known as Pipeline Karen across 3 states. She put her house on the market 2 months later, but not before receiving a detailed violation notice about her non-conforming for sale sign placement. The new architectural review committee, led by Mrs. Chun, was particularly thorough in their inspection. They even brought out a ruler to measure the sign's distance from the sidewalk. The last time I saw Margaret, she was supervising movers as they loaded her designer furniture into a truck. She avoided making eye contact with any of the neighbors, especially me. Her infamous clipboard was nowhere in sight. My driveway still has that slightly darker patch that started it all. The HOA's new guidelines specifically address concrete discoloration. Natural weathering patterns are considered normal and acceptable, as they tell the story of our community's history. Sometimes, I catch my neighbors glancing at it and smiling as they walk past. The gas line repair crew did an amazing job restoring everything. They even added some extra safety markers and updated all the utility mapping in the neighborhood. Ted organized a neighborhood emergency response workshop, which has become a monthly event. It turns out, nothing brings a community together quite like surviving a wannabe HOA dictator with a jackhammer. We still have an HOA, of course. The lawns are still neat, the house is well maintained, and the property values steady. But there's a different atmosphere now. The monthly meetings include potluck dinners and actually feel like community gatherings. Mrs. Chen's garden gnome collection has grown. She now has a whole yoga class of them in various poses. And that slightly darker patch on my driveway? I've grown quite fond of it. It's a reminder that sometimes the cracks in our perfect facades can lead to something better, a stronger community, wiser neighbors, and the occasional viral video sensation. Though I do make sure to check my tires every morning. Some habits die hard. Life in Maplewood Heights settled into a new rhythm after Margaret Hargrove's dramatic exit. The neighborhood, once a battleground of petty violations and power struggles, now felt like a community again. The monthly HOA meetings, once dreaded affairs filled with tension and accusations, had transformed into lively gatherings where neighbors shared potluck dishes and discussed ways to improve the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen's garden gnome yoga class became a beloved landmark, and even the most rule-abiding residents couldn't help but smile at the whimsical sight. But just as we began to relax, a new challenge emerged, one that would test the strength of our newfound unity. It started with a simple notice in the community newsletter. A new resident had moved into the house at the end of Maple Lane. The house, a sprawling modern structure with floor-to-ceiling windows, had been vacant for months. The previous owners had moved out abruptly, leaving behind rumors of financial troubles and a hastily sold property. The new owner, a man named Victor Kane, was an enigma. He kept to himself, rarely seen outside his home except for the occasional late-night stroll. His presence was unsettling, not because of anything he did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't attend HOA meetings, didn't respond to welcome letters, and didn't even bother to trim the overgrown hedges that now obscured his front yard. At first, we chalked it up to eccentricity. After all, Maplewood Heights had seen its fair share of odd characters. But then the complaints started. It began with the Patels. Their dog, a gentle golden retriever named Max, had started barking incessantly at night. At first, they thought it was just a phase, but then they noticed something strange. Max would only bark when he was near the fence that bordered Victor Kane's property. "It's like he's sensing something," Mrs. Patel said during one of our potluck dinners. "But every time we go out to check, there's nothing there." Then there were the Hendersons. Their teenage daughter, Emily, claimed she saw strange lights coming from Victor's house late at night. "It wasn't like normal lights," she said. "They were flickering, like candles, but not really." Even Ted, our retired firefighter and neighborhood watch coordinator, had his own story. "I was out for my evening walk last night," he said, his voice low, "and I swear I heard something coming from his backyard. It sounded like machinery, but when I got closer, it stopped." The complaints piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. But without any concrete evidence, there was little we could do. Victor Kane was a private man, and as long as he wasn't breaking any rules, the HOA had no grounds to intervene. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. As a former journalist, I had a knack for digging up information, and Victor Kane's mysterious behavior was too intriguing to ignore. I started by researching his background, but what I found, or rather, what I didn't find, only deepened the mystery. Victor Kane had no online presence. No social media profiles, no public records, not even a LinkedIn account. It was as if he had appeared out of thin air. The only lead I had was the name of the real estate agent who had sold him the house, a woman named Linda Grayson. I reached out to Linda, posing as a potential buyer interested in the neighborhood. She was friendly and eager to help, but when I mentioned Victor Kane, her tone changed. "Oh, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice suddenly guarded. "He's a very private individual. I'm afraid I can't share much about him." "But surely you must have some information," I pressed. "Background checks, references, anything?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Look," Linda said finally, "all I can tell you is that Mr. Kane paid in cash. No mortgage, no financing. And he insisted on a quick closing. Beyond that, I really can't say more." Her evasiveness only fueled my curiosity. Who was Victor Kane, and why was he so determined to remain anonymous? The mystery took a darker turn one rainy night. I was working late when I heard a loud crash coming from outside. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding, and saw a figure darting across my backyard. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside. The figure was gone by the time I reached the backyard, but they had left something behind, a set of muddy footprints leading toward Victor Kane's property. I followed the trail, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, until I reached the fence that separated our yards. That's when I saw it. A section of the fence had been pried open, the wood splintered and broken. Beyond it, Victor's backyard was shrouded in shadows, but I could just make out the outline of a large shed. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, I heard a faint humming sound. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. But before I could decide what to do, a voice behind me made me jump. "What are you doing here?" I spun around to find Victor Kane standing a few feet away, his face illuminated by the beam of my flashlight. He was taller than I had imagined, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to bore into me. I heard a noise," I stammered, trying to steady my voice. "I thought someone might be breaking into your property." Victor's expression was unreadable. "That's very neighborly of you," he said, his tone cold. "But as you can see, everything is fine. You should go home now." There was something in his voice, a warning, perhaps, that sent a chill down my spine. I nodded and turned to leave, but not before casting one last glance at the shed. The door was now closed, and the humming had stopped. The next morning, I shared what had happened with Ted and a few other neighbors. They were just as concerned as I was, but none of us knew what to do. Victor Kane was clearly hiding something, but without proof, we were powerless. That's when Mrs. Chin suggested we call in a professional. "I have a cousin who works in private investigation," she said. "He's discreet, and he's helped me with sensitive matters in the past." We agreed, and a few days later, Mrs. Chin's cousin, a man named David Lynn, arrived in Maplewood Heights. He was in his late 30s, with a calm demeanor and a sharp eye for detail. After hearing our stories, he agreed to look into Victor Kane. David's investigation was thorough. He spent days observing Victor's house, tracking his movements, and even posing as a utility worker to get a closer look at the property. What he discovered was both shocking and terrifying. Victor Kane wasn't just a reclusive homeowner. He was a former scientist who had been involved in a controversial government project. The project, which had been shut down years ago, involved experiments in energy manipulation and artificial intelligence. According to David's sources, Victor had gone rogue after the project was terminated, taking sensitive technology with him. "That shed in his backyard," David said during our final meeting. "It's not a shed. It's a lab. And whatever he's working on in there, it's not good." Armed with this new information, we knew we had to act. But confronting Victor directly was too risky. Instead, we decided to go through official channels. Ted contacted the local police, while I reached out to a journalist friend who had connections in the tech industry. The authorities moved quickly. Within days, a warrant was issued, and a team of investigators descended on Victor's property. What they found was beyond anything we could have imagined. The shed was indeed a lab, filled with advanced equipment and prototypes of devices that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi movie. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of journals detailing Victor's experiments. He had been trying to create a device capable of manipulating human behavior, a device he planned to test on the residents of Maplewood Heights. Victor was arrested, and the lab was dismantled. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the experience left us shaken. We had come together to protect our community, but the cost had been high. In the months that followed, Maplewood Heights returned to its peaceful ways. The HOA, now led by Mrs. Chun and a reformed board, focused on fostering a sense of community rather than enforcing rigid rules. The monthly potluck dinners became a cherished tradition, and the garden gnome yoga class grew to include gnomes from all over the neighborhood. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what we had accomplished. We had faced a threat that could have torn us apart, but instead, we had come together and emerged stronger. But as I walked past Victor Kane's now empty house, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story wasn't over. The world was changing, and with it, the challenges we faced. Maplewood Heights had survived a wannabe HOA dictator and a rogue scientist, but what lay ahead? Only time would tell. Victor Kane's arrest sent shockwaves through Maplewood Heights. The once quiet neighborhood found itself thrust into the spotlight as news outlets picked up the story of the rogue scientist who had been secretly conducting experiments in his backyard lab. For weeks, reporters camped out on our streets, interviewing residents and speculating about what Victor had been trying to achieve. The authorities assured us that the danger had passed. Victor's lab had been dismantled, and all his equipment had been confiscated. But the experience left a lingering unease. We had all been so focused on Margaret Hargrove's petty tyranny that we had failed to notice the real threat lurking in our midst. In the weeks that followed, the HOA held a series of community meetings to address the fallout. Mrs. Chun, now the board president, led the discussions with her trademark calm and wisdom. "We've been through a lot," she said during one meeting. "But we've also learned a lot. We've learned that we're stronger when we work together. And we've learned that we can't take our safety for granted." The meetings resulted in several new initiatives, including a neighborhood watch program led by Ted and a community emergency preparedness plan. We also decided to install security cameras throughout the neighborhood, not to spy on each other, but to ensure that we would never be caught off guard again. Just as we were beginning to move on, a new family moved into Victor Kane's old house. The Millers were a young couple with 2 small children, and they seemed eager to put the house's dark past behind them. They painted the exterior a cheerful yellow, planted a garden in the backyard, and even hosted a block party to introduce themselves to the neighborhood. At first, their presence was a welcome change. The children's laughter echoed through the streets, and the house, once a source of fear, now felt like a symbol of renewal. But it wasn't long before strange things started happening again. It began with small things. The Patel's dog, Max, started barking at night again, just as he had when Victor lived there. Then there were reports of flickering lights in the Miller's house, even though they insisted they hadn't noticed anything unusual. The final straw came when Ted found a strange device buried in his backyard. It was small and metallic, with a blinking red light. He brought it to the next HOA meeting, and the room fell silent as we all stared at it. "What is it?" someone asked. "I don't know," Ted said, "but I don't like it." We decided to call in an expert. David Lynn, the private investigator who had helped us with Victor Kane, agreed to take a look. His findings were alarming. "This is a surveillance device," he said, "and it's not something you can just buy off the shelf. This is high-tech, military-grade stuff." The revelation sent a chill through the room. If someone was planting surveillance devices in our yards, it could only mean one thing. Victor Kane hadn't been working alone. David's investigation revealed that Victor had been part of a larger network of rogue scientists and tech enthusiasts. Many of them had gone underground after the government shut down their projects, but they were still active, still experimenting, and still dangerous. "Victor was just the tip of the iceberg," David said. "There are others out there, and they're not going to stop just because we caught one of them." The news was a wake-up call. We had thought the danger was over, but it was clear now that we were still in the crosshairs. The question was, what could we do about it? We decided to take matters into our own hands. With David's help, we set up a neighborhood-wide surveillance system, complete with motion sensors and night vision cameras. We also established a rotating watch schedule, ensuring that someone was always on duty to monitor the feeds. It wasn't long before we caught our first break. One night, the cameras picked up a figure sneaking into the Miller's backyard. Ted and a few other neighbors confronted the intruder, and after a brief struggle, they managed to subdue him. The man turned out to be a former associate of Victor Kane's. Under questioning, he revealed that Victor had been working on a device capable of controlling human behavior, and that he had been close to completing it when we intervened. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice trembling. "This technology, it's too powerful. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could change everything." The authorities were called in, and the man was taken into custody. But his warning stayed with us. We knew that as long as the technology existed, we would never be safe. In the end, it was Mrs. Chen who came up with the solution. "We need to destroy it," she said. "All of it. Every last piece of that technology." With the help of David and a team of experts, we located and dismantled the remaining devices. It was a risky operation, but we knew it was the only way to ensure that the technology could never be used against us. The final chapter of our ordeal came to a close with a neighborhood celebration. We gathered in the community center, sharing food, stories, and laughter. For the first time in months, we felt truly safe. As I looked around the room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. We had faced unimaginable challenges, but we had come through them stronger and more united than ever. Mrs. Chen stood to make a toast. "To Maplewood Heights," she said, raising her glass. "May we always stand together, no matter what comes our way." We all raised our glasses in agreement. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but we were ready to face them, together. Epilogue, the legacy. Years later, Maplewood Heights is still a thriving community. The HOA, now a model of transparency and cooperation, continues to foster a sense of unity among its residents. The Garden Gnome Yoga class has become a beloved tradition, and the security cameras, though rarely needed, serve as a reminder of the battles we fought and the lessons we learned. As for me, I've taken up writing again, chronicling the story of our neighborhood's resilience. It's a story of ordinary people coming together to face extraordinary challenges, and it's a story I hope will inspire others to do the same. Because in the end, that's what Maplewood Heights taught me, that no matter how dark the night, the dawn will always come. And when it does, we'll be ready to face it, together. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.